It was an ordinary Tuesday in October 2022 when Sarah Williams, an employee of the Coastal Bay County Records Department in California, opened yet another dusty drawer in the courthouse archive. Among hundreds of documents yellowed by time, her fingers touched something that would make her blood freeze. A folded birth certificate dated March 15, 1969. The name written by hand in cursive script was Christine Elizabeth Matthews. But it wasn't just another lost document. It was proof of a life that had simply vanished from the world in 1987. If you're watching this video, prepare yourself to dive into one of the most disturbing and mysterious cases in California. A story that will make you question everything you think you know about disappearances. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now, because you won't want to miss the next chapters of this investigation. Turn on the notification bell, because today we're going to begin a journey that will leave you sleepless for days. I promise you that by the end of this series, we will discover together what really happened to Christine Elizabeth Matthews. Or at least, we'll get closer to the truth than any official investigation has managed in 3.5 decades. Christine had just turned 18 when she disappeared. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we need to know who she really was. Christine wasn't just another statistic. She was a young woman 5 feet 3 inches tall, with wavy blonde hair that reached her shoulders, blue eyes that sparkled when she smiled. She had a small scar on her forehead, the result of a skateboard fall at age 10, and a star-shaped birthmark on her left ankle. It was March 1987. The United States was living through the height of the Reagan era. On the radios, George Michael was playing, Madonna had just released La Isla Bonita, and young people dreamed of the American dream. Christine was the daughter of Robert Matthews, a 43-year-old mechanic, and Linda Matthews, a 40-year-old secretary. They lived in a 2-story house in the suburb of Ocean View, in Coastal Bay, a peaceful seaside resort on the central coast of California. Christine was the type of girl everyone knew in the neighborhood. She woke up every day at 6:30 in the morning to run 2 miles along the beach before going to school. She was in her senior year at Coastal Bay High School and dreamed of studying elementary education at UC Santa Barbara. Her teachers described her as an exemplary student, always with her books organized and participative in classes. She had a special passion for English and spent hours in the school library, lost among the pages of John Steinbeck and Harper Lee. But Christine also had her typical American teenager side of the 80s. She loved dancing at school parties, knew all of Duran Duran's songs by heart, and had posters of Tom Cruise and Patrick Swayze pasted on the wall of the room she shared with her younger sister, Jessica, who was 15 years old. On Sunday afternoons, when she wasn't studying, she liked to walk along the Coastal Bay Pier with her friends, dreaming about what she would do when she graduated from high school. Her parents described Christine as a responsible girl who had never caused problems. She didn't drink, didn't smoke, and her biggest act of rebellion was arriving 15 minutes late from the movies, when she watched blockbusters at the Coastal Bay Mall. She had a boyfriend, Michael Thompson, 19 years old, who worked as a salesperson in a sporting goods store at the mall. They had been dating for 10 months and, according to friends, were already talking about marriage after Christine graduated from college. The relationship with Michael was approved by the family. He was polite, hardworking, and always brought flowers to Christine on Sundays. Linda used to say that they made a perfect couple, and that Michael would be a good husband for her daughter. Robert, more reserved, had given his blessing to the relationship, but always warned Christine not to rush, to finish her studies first. Christine's routine was predictable and peaceful. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, she attended typing classes at Coastal Bay Community College, dreaming of getting a part-time office job. Tuesday and Thursday, she worked as a babysitter for a neighboring family, taking care of 2 small children. On Saturdays, she worked part-time as a saleswoman at the Barnes & Noble bookstore in the mall, where she earned money to buy books and go to the movies with Michael. March 15, 1987, was a special Sunday. Christine was turning 18, the legal age she had been waiting for so long. The party was typical of the Matthews family, American middle class. Linda prepared a chocolate cake with cream frosting, her daughter's favorite, and Robert had saved for months to buy an IBM Selectric typewriter that Christine had wanted for a long time to do her schoolwork at home. The morning began with the traditional happy birthday sung by the family. Christine woke up at 8 o'clock with Jessica jumping on her bed, shouting, "Happy birthday, sis!" The room shared by the 2 girls was decorated in shades of pink and blue, with 2 single beds separated by a dresser, where Christine kept her favorite books, and Jessica her 17 and Teen Beat magazines. Michael arrived at 9 in the morning bringing a bouquet of pink roses and a small silver chain with a heart-shaped pendant. It was the most expensive gift he had ever given anyone, costing almost his entire week's salary. Christine was moved and allowed him to put the chain around her neck in the presence of her parents, who smiled approvingly at the gesture. The afternoon party brought together about 25 people, close relatives, dear neighbors, and some friends from school. Christine wore a lavender dress she had bought, especially for the occasion at Macy's, white low-heeled shoes, and Michael's new chain shining around her neck. Her closest friends, Amanda and Jennifer, arrived at 2 in the afternoon carrying a joint gift, a Coach bag they had bought at the mall. During the party, Christine seemed radiant. She chatted animatedly with everyone, thanked them for the gifts, and was already making plans for the future. She talked about applying to UC Santa Barbara in the fall to study elementary education. She wanted to be an elementary school teacher. She said she had patience and a way with children. Michael listened to everything smiling, agreeing with his girlfriend's plans. The cake was cut at 4 in the afternoon. Christine made a wish in silence, blew out the 18 candles all at once, and everyone applauded. No one ever knew what her last wish was, but her sister Jessica always said she believed Christine had wished to be accepted to UC Santa Barbara and to be happy forever with Michael. The party ended at nightfall. The last guests left around 7 at night. Michael said goodbye to Christine with a kiss on the cheek, in the presence of her parents, and promised to visit her the following Tuesday. It was Sunday, and he needed to wake up early on Monday to work. Christine waved from the porch as he drove his blue Camaro along the Pacific Coast Highway, the car's lights disappearing into the fog typical of the California coast. That night, Christine had dinner with the family, helped wash the party dishes, and retired to her room at 9 o'clock. Jessica remembers that they talked in the dark about the gifts received and about how Christine was anxious to use the new typewriter for her high school final papers. It was the last conversation the sisters had. Christine woke up on Monday, March 16th, at 6:30, as always. She had breakfast with the family, kissed her parents on the forehead, and left for school at 7:45. She wore dark blue jeans, a white Gap blouse, white Nike sneakers, and carried the new bag she had received as a gift. Linda waved from the door and shouted, "Have a great day, honey." Christine replied, "See you later, Mom," and headed down Ocean View Drive toward the school bus stop. That was the last time anyone in the Matthews family saw Christine alive. But no one knew that a sequence of events was about to transform that ordinary Monday into the date that would divide their lives between before and after. No one imagined that in a few hours the family would be plunged into a nightmare that would last 3.5 decades. And no one could predict that the name Christine Elizabeth Matthews would become synonymous with one of the biggest unsolved mysteries on the California coast. What happened on that day in March 1987? Why did an 18-year-old young woman simply disappear without leaving traces? And more importantly, what was her birth certificate doing lost in a courthouse file 35 years later? In the next chapter, we're going to reconstruct minute by minute the last hours of Christine Elizabeth Matthews. We're going to discover exactly where she was, who she talked to, and when the terrifying silence began. Because the truth about this case is hidden in the details that no one paid attention to at the time. Monday, March 16th, 1987, 7:45 in the morning. Christine Elizabeth Matthews walks down Ocean View, drive towards school. Bus stop number 47. The day dawns cloudy, with a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius and a cold breeze coming from the Pacific. She wears dark blue jeans, a white Gap blouse, white Nike sneakers, and carries the new Coach bag she had received for her birthday. Mrs. Henderson, the 72-year-old neighbor who always watered the plants on the porch at 7:40, sees her pass by on the sidewalk. She has known Christine since the family moved to Ocean View, drive in 1975, and waves to her, who responds with a smile and a wave of her hand. It's the last image anyone has of her smiling. At 7:52, Christine arrives at the bus stop at the corner of Ocean View Drive and Pacific Coast Highway. Tommy Rodriguez, a 16-year-old boy who was in his sophomore year, was already waiting. They talk briefly about the math test they would have in first period. Christine mentions that she's nervous because she couldn't study properly over the weekend because of the birthday party. "At least now I'm officially an adult," she jokes, showing her new driver's license that she had gotten the previous Friday. The school bus arrives at 7:57. Christine gets on, greeting the driver, Mr. Wilson, who has known her for 3 years, and sits in the 5th row on the right side, next to the window. Tommy sits beside her. During the 28-minute journey to Coastal Bay High School, Christine stays looking out the window, apparently lost in thought. Tommy would later tell the police that she seemed calm, maybe a little tired from the party, but showed no signs of worry or nervousness. At 8:25, the bus stops in front of Coastal Bay High School, a red brick building built in 1962 with a capacity for 1,200 students. Christine gets off waving to Tommy and walks toward the main entrance. It's exactly 200 meters walking across the courtyard, a route she had been taking for 4 years and knew by heart. Mrs. Patricia Collins, the school secretary who always stayed at the reception during student arrival, sees Christine pass through the main door at 8:28. She greets her, as she does every morning. "Good morning, Christine. How was your birthday party?" Christine smiles and replies, "It was perfect, Mrs. Collins. Thank you for asking." It's the last recorded conversation she has with a school employee. Christine goes up to the 2nd floor, where her classroom is located. Her friends Amanda Reeves and Jennifer Clark are already there, talking about the new Dallas episode that had aired on TV on Friday. Christine joins them, shows Michael's chain again, and comments that she's anxious to use the new typewriter for her final papers. "I can't wait to type my history essay," she says. "My handwriting is terrible." The first class is Algebra 2, with Mr. Harrison. Christine sits in the 3rd row, opens her Trapper Keeper notebook, and tries to pay attention to the test review. Mr. Harrison notices that she seems more distracted than normal, probably still processing the emotion of her birthday. During the break from 9:40 to 10 o'clock, Christine stays in the courtyard talking with her friends about her plans for the next school year. The second class is American History, with Mrs. Davidson. Christine participates normally in the discussion about the Civil War, asking pertinent questions and writing everything down in her notebook. The third class, English Literature, ends at 11:50. This is where the timeline begins to get nebulous. At 11:55, Christine leaves the classroom together with Amanda and Jennifer. In the hallway, they talk about lunch plans. Amanda suggests that the three of them eat together in the school cafeteria, as they normally do. Jennifer immediately agrees, but Christine says she can't, that she needs to go to the library to research a history paper that's overdue. This is the last recorded conversation of Christine with someone she knew. At 12:10, librarian Mr. Stevens sees Christine entering the library. She goes straight to the American History section and takes 3 books about post-Civil War Reconstruction. Mr. Stevens would later describe that she seemed normal, focused on her studies, without haste or apparent nervousness. At 12:45, Mr. Stevens notices that Christine is organizing the books and preparing to leave. She approaches the loan desk and asks if she can take 2 of the books home. He allows it, registers the loans in the library's manual system, and sees her leaving through the main library door at 12:50. And then, simply, Christine Elizabeth Matthews disappears. There are no more reliable witnesses. There are no more confirmed sightings. The 18-year-old young woman who had woken up that morning planning to take a math test and research for a history paper was never seen alive again. But the family only realized that something was terribly wrong many hours later. Linda Matthews was at home preparing lunch when she began to worry. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, and Christine still hadn't arrived. Normally, even when she stayed at school for extra activities, she called to let them know or arrived home by 2 o'clock at the latest. But Linda thought that maybe her daughter had decided to stay longer in the library or have lunch with friends, something that sometimes happened. At 3:30, the worry increased. Christine knew that her mother arrived from work at 3 and always found her at home doing homework. It was a routine they had maintained for years. Linda interrupted dinner preparation and went out to the porch, hoping to see her daughter walking down Ocean View Drive at any moment. At 4:30, she took the first action. She called the school to speak with Mrs. Collins. The secretary said she had seen Christine in the morning, but that the school had closed at 3 o'clock and didn't know if she had left at the normal time. This information made Linda's heart race. If Christine had left school at 3, where had she been for an hour and a half? At 5:15, when Robert arrived from the mechanical shop where he worked, he found his wife in a state of growing nervousness. Linda told him about her daughter's inexplicable delay. Robert, trying to stay calm, suggested that maybe Christine had gone to the mall with friends or visited Michael at work without warning. But even saying this, he knew it didn't make sense. Christine was too responsible for that. At 6 o'clock, they called Amanda's house. Mrs. Reeves said that the girls had separated at noon at school, and that Christine said she was going to the library. Amanda had been home since 3 in the afternoon. Linda felt her stomach tighten. If Christine had left the library at 3, where had she been for 3 hours? At 6:30, they called Jennifer's house. The story was the same. The girls had separated at noon in the school hallway, and Christine said she was going to study in the library. Jennifer, seeing the desperation in Linda's voice, offered to help with the searches. At 7 o'clock, Robert made a decision that would change everything. He went to Sports Galaxy, the store where Michael worked. The young man was closing the register when he saw Robert enter with an expression he would never forget. When he learned that Christine had been missing for 7 hours. Michael turned pale. He immediately closed the store and joined the searches, suggesting places where she could be. The beach, where they used to walk. The Barnes and Noble bookstore where she worked on Saturdays. The homes of some school colleagues. They spent the night searching. They drove through the dark streets of Coastal Bay, knocked on the doors of acquaintances, asked strangers if they had seen a blonde young woman with blue eyes. They visited the hospital, the police station, even the beach, fearing that something terrible had happened. Nothing. Christine had simply vanished. On the morning of Tuesday, March 17th, when Christine completes 24 hours missing, Robert makes the most difficult decision of his life. He goes to the Coastal Bay Police Department to register his daughter's disappearance. The detective responsible for the case was Detective James Morrison, a 55-year-old man, veteran of the Coastal Bay Police Force. When Robert arrived at the station with eyes red from exhaustion and despair, the detective listened attentively to the report, but his reaction was a cruel reflection of the mentality of the time. "Look, Mr. Matthews," said Detective Morrison, "your daughter just turned 18 2 days ago. She's legally an adult now. Sometimes young people do impulsive things. Maybe she ran off with some boyfriend. Maybe she decided to see the world. Have you folks had any fights recently?" Robert shook his head vehemently. "No, Detective, Christine isn't like that. She would never leave without telling us. Something happened to my daughter." His voice trembled with contained emotion. The detective, following the protocols of the time, explained that he could only open an official investigation if there were clear indications of crime. Missing adult disappearance was not a police priority, especially when dealing with a young woman who had just left high school. The official suggestion was to wait a few more days. But Robert didn't give up. He insisted, begged, threatened to contact the local press. Finally, Detective Morrison agreed to register a missing person report. It was a bureaucratic document, without real investigative weight, but it was something. The first official theory was exactly what Robert feared hearing: voluntary flight. For the Coastal Bay Police, in 1987, an 18-year-old young woman who disappeared 2 days after reaching legal age had clearly run away to live her own life. Maybe with a secret boyfriend, maybe to Los Angeles or San Francisco, maybe simply to escape small-town life. Michael was interrogated 3 times in the first week. The questions were direct and invasive. Were you guys intimate? Could she be pregnant? Did you have a fight? Did she mention other guys? Michael answered everything with patience, always denying any possibility of flight. He knew Christine, knew she would never make her family suffer that way. The second theory emerged after a week of fruitless searches, a crime of opportunity. Maybe Christine had been kidnapped by a stranger between school and home. Maybe someone had approached her offering a ride. The police began investigating men from 20 to 50 years old in the region who had a history of sexual crimes or violence. This line of investigation led to nothing. Coastal Bay in 1987 was a small town with a low crime rate. There were few records of sexual crimes in the region. Communication between police departments was done by phone or fax. It was impossible to cross data or identify criminal patterns efficiently. The third theory, the most frightening, began to gain strength after 2 weeks: human trafficking. Maybe Christine had been taken by a network of traffickers who targeted attractive young women for forced prostitution. In 1987, America was beginning to become aware of criminal networks that took young women from the West Coast to large urban centers or even to other countries. This possibility terrified the Matthews family. The idea that Christine could be suffering somewhere far from home, held against her will, was unbearable for Linda. She began to have nightmares, to lose weight rapidly, to develop an anxiety that would prevent her from sleeping for the next years. Robert, on the other hand, transformed into an amateur detective. He spent afternoons after work putting up posters with Christine's photo throughout Coastal Bay. The chosen photo had been taken at the junior year prom, where she appeared smiling, wearing a royal blue dress with her hair down and a hopeful look toward the future. The posters had a simple message. Missing, Christine Elizabeth Matthews, 18 years old. Last seen March 16, 1987. Any information, please call. Followed by the family's phone number. The Ocean View community mobilized impressively. Neighbors joined the searches. Local merchants spread Christine's photo in their establishments. The Coastal Bay Methodist Church organized prayer vigils. But none of this brought answers. The technological limitations of 1987 made any investigation a monumental challenge. There were no security cameras on the streets or at school. There were no cell phones to track movements. There were no computers to cross data between police departments. Communication depended on landline phones and letters. The media was limited to local newspapers, radio, and television that was still consolidating. Christine's case received some attention from the local press. The Coastal Bay Tribune published a story on the front page. Local teen vanishes after 18th birthday. KBAY News mentioned the case on the 6 o'clock news for a week. But without new developments, the story quickly disappeared from the headlines. After a month of investigations that led nowhere, Detective Morrison had a difficult conversation with the Matthews family. The case would be temporarily filed. There were no concrete clues, no reliable witnesses of what happened after Christine left the library, no evidence of crime. Christine would be officially classified as missing voluntarily until new information emerged. This decision devastated the family. For them, it was as if the police had given up on Christine, as if she had become just another number in the statistics of missing persons. Robert left the station that day with the certainty that, if he wanted to find his daughter, he would have to do it alone. But what the Matthews family didn't know was that Christine's case was about to become much more complicated. Because in 1987, other young women had disappeared under similar circumstances in Central California. And these connections would only be discovered years later, when it was too late to follow clues that could have led to the truth. Jessica, the younger sister, developed a routine that would break anyone's heart. Every day, after school, she walked along the route that Christine took between home and the bus stop, hoping to see her sister turning the corner. For years, she maintained this innocent hope that Christine would simply come home as if nothing had happened. Linda stopped working for 3 months. The IBM typewriter that Christine never got to use remained covered by a sheet in the corner of the room. She said she couldn't concentrate on anything while she didn't know where her oldest daughter was. The Prude house that had once been full of laughter and conversations became a silent place, where every car noise in the street made everyone run to the window. Michael continued visiting the Matthews family religiously. Every Tuesday and Thursday he appeared at the house, sat in the living room, and talked with Robert about possibilities, about places where they could still look. He never stopped loving Christine, never seriously dated another person, as if he were waiting for her to return so they could continue the plans they had made together. The silence that began that Monday in March deepened as the days passed. It wasn't just Christine's absence, but the absence of answers, of clues, of hope. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth, leaving only a destroyed family and a disturbed community. But the mystery was just beginning. Because in the coming years, the Matthews family would discover that Christine's disappearance was just the tip of a much more sinister iceberg, and that the truth about what happened on that day in March 1987 was buried deeper than any official investigation had reached. In the next chapter, we're going to cross the decades of silence that followed. We're going to discover how the family dealt with 35 years without answers, what other clues emerged and disappeared, and how time transformed hope into obsession. Because the story of Christine Elizabeth Matthews didn't end in 1987. In fact, it was just beginning. 1990. 3 years had passed since Christine's disappearance, and the Matthews family had become a shadow of what it was before. Robert developed the obsession that would dominate the rest of his life. Every weekend, he took his Ford pickup and drove to neighboring cities carrying a folder with photos of Christine, Xeroxed flyers, and a hope that renewed itself with each trip. Monterrey, Santa Cruz, San Luis Obispo, Salinas. He visited every police department, every hospital, every morgue in the region. His routine was always the same. He arrived in a city at 7 in the morning, walked through the main streets showing his daughter's photo to anyone who wanted to look, visited shopping centers where teenagers gathered, and returned home at nightfall with empty hands and a heart a little heavier. Linda had stopped talking about Christine in the present. My daughter was like this. She loved that. She had a special way with children. As if unconsciously, she knew that Christine wouldn't return, but refused to accept this reality. The room that Christine shared with Jessica remained untouched. The bed always made, the books in the same position, the IBM typewriter she never got to use gathering dust on top of the desk. Jessica, now 18 years old, the same age Christine was when she disappeared, made a decision that shocked the family. She left home to study at UCLA. She said she couldn't live in the shadow of a sister who had become a ghost. Every birthday of Christine's was a renewed mourning. Every Christmas had an empty chair. Every family conversation inevitably led to the same place. Where was Christine? 1993 brought the first devastating false hope. A woman of about 24 years old was found with amnesia in a psychiatric hospital in Los Angeles. She had physical characteristics similar to Christine's: similar height, blonde hair, light eyes. The Matthews family drove to LA with racing hearts, carrying old photos, clothes that had belonged to Christine, anything that could awaken the woman's memory. When they arrived at the hospital, Robert looked at the young woman for long minutes. There was a disturbing resemblance, but he knew deep in his heart that it wasn't his daughter. Linda, desperate to believe, insisted it could be Christine after years living on the streets. "Look at her eyes, Robert. Look how she looks at me." But when they did the DNA test, available for the first time at that time, the cruel reality was confirmed. It wasn't Christine. This experience almost destroyed Linda. For 2 weeks, she had allowed herself to believe that her daughter was alive, even sick, even without memory. The disappointment was so deep that she spent a month without leaving home, refusing to eat adequately, lost in a depression that worried the entire family. 1995 marked a significant change in the investigation. Detective Morrison retired, and the case was transferred to AIE, young and ambitious female detective named Detective Sarah Rodriguez. She had studied criminology at UC Berkeley and brought a different perspective to archived cases. Sarah reviewed all the files from Christine's disappearance and reached a disturbing conclusion. There was a pattern. Between 1985 and 1989, 8 young women between 16 and 20 years old had disappeared on the central coast of California. all in similar circumstances. They left home for routine activities and never returned. All came from middle-class working families. All were described as responsible and had never caused problems for their parents. The names of the other victims were Teresa Martinez, 17 years old, disappeared in Salinas in 1985. Michelle Johnson, 19 years old, disappeared in Santa Cruz in 1986. Ashley Wilson, 16 years old, disappeared in Monterey in 1987, just 1 month after Christine. Rebecca Davis, 20 years old, disappeared in San Luis Obispo in 1988. Vanessa Torres, 18 years old, disappeared in Watsonville in 1988. Jennifer Lopez, 16 years old, disappeared in Seaside in 1989. And Samantha Brown, 17 years old, disappeared in Carmel in 1989. Detective Rodriguez began working on the theory that all these young women had been victims of the same criminal or criminal group. She tried to find connections between the victims. They frequented the same places, knew the same people, had similar routines. But the limitations of the files from that time and the lack of communication between police departments had allowed these connections to go unnoticed for years. Robert was at the same time hopeful and terrified by this discovery. Hopeful because finally someone was treating Christine's disappearance as part of something bigger, more serious. Terrified because it suggested that his daughter had been the victim of something much more sinister than he had imagined. Detective Rodriguez organized a meeting with all the families of the missing young women. It was a devastating meeting, held at the Coastal Bay Police Department on a rainy afternoon in June 1995. 8 destroyed families, each carrying their own version of the same nightmare. Parents who had aged prematurely, mothers who developed anxiety disorders, siblings who grew up in the shadow of sisters who became ghosts. During this meeting, an intriguing clue emerged. 4 of the 8 families mentioned that their daughters had commented about an older man who offered work for young women in the region. An elegant, well-dressed man who said he represented a modeling agency or a marketing company. The descriptions were vague. About 40 years old, dark hair, always in a suit, driving a dark sedan. Linda was shocked to hear this. She vaguely remembered Christine having mentioned something about a man who had offered work to her in the week before the disappearance. At the time, she hadn't given it importance, thought it was just teenager talk. But now, hearing similar reports from other families, the memory came back with full force. He said she had the look for modeling work with a new agency coming to the Central Coast, Linda told the detective, her hands trembling. Christine laughed and said he seemed professional, wearing a suit and tie, but she wasn't interested. My God, why didn't I pay more attention? The investigation about this mysterious man began immediately. Detective Rodriguez made composite sketches based on the family's descriptions, distributed the drawings throughout the region, investigated agencies that had been established on the Central Coast during the period. But 1995 was still a time of significant technological limitations. There was no internet to cross data nationally. There were no security cameras to review. There were no social networks to track people. After 6 months of intense investigation, the mysterious man's trail went cold. No modeling or marketing agency had hired representatives in the region during the relevant period. None of the composite sketches were recognized by reliable witnesses. It was as if this man had been a collective mirage of desperate families. The 2000s brought a technological revolution that completely changed investigative possibilities. The Internet became popular, allowing information to be shared instantly between police departments across the country. Digital databases replaced handwritten physical files. DNA became a standard investigative tool. the FBI began creating national profiles of serial killers. In 2003, Detective Rodriguez, now more experienced and with access to new technologies, officially reopened the case of the 8 missing young women. She digitized all the files, created a unified database, and began cross-referencing information with similar cases across the country through VICAP, the National Violent Crime System. The results were disturbing. Between 1980 and 1990, more than 200 young women had disappeared under similar circumstances on the West Coast. The vast majority were never found. Some were discovered dead years later. Others simply vanished without leaving traces. This discovery put Christine's case in a much broader and more terrifying perspective. It wasn't about a local criminal acting on the Central Coast, but possibly an organized network operating on a national scale. Robert, now over 60 years old, had become a known figure in circles of families of missing persons. He participated in support groups, organized demonstrations, pressured authorities for better investigations. His house transformed into an informal archive about missing persons, walls covered with photos, maps with pins marking disappearance locations, folders organized by years and regions. In 2005, 18 years after Christine's disappearance, Robert made a discovery that deeply disturbed him. Reviewing FBI files that had been made available through the Freedom of Information Act, he found a report about a man arrested in Los Angeles for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment of a 20-year-old young woman. The man's physical characteristics corresponded exactly to the descriptions of the supposed agent who had approached several of the missing young women. The man's name was David Edward Collins, 45 years old at the time, native of San Diego, but living in Los Angeles. He had been arrested in flagrante delicto, keeping a young woman in captivity in an apartment in Hollywood. During interrogation, he confessed to having kidnapped other women over the years, but never gave details about what he had done with them. Robert ran to Detective Rodriguez with this information. They investigated Collins's case and discovered that he had been sentenced to 20 years in prison, but had been released in 2000 for good behavior. Even more disturbing, there were no records of where he was living after his release. The search for David Collins became an obsession for Robert. He hired a private investigator with his savings, traveled to Los Angeles dozens of times, talked with the man's former cellmates. But Collins had disappeared as completely as his daughter. No employment records, no official address, no bank activity. In 2010, 23 years later, a clue emerged that renewed the family's hopes. A middle-aged woman contacted the FBI saying she had escaped from captivity in 1987 and that she recognized Collins's photo in criminal files. She told a terrifying story about being held in an isolated ranch in the Mojave Desert for 4 months, along with other young women whom she never knew what happened to afterward. The woman, who preferred to remain anonymous, described specific details that corresponded to Collins's modus operandi: the elegant approach offering work, the dark sedan, the isolated ranch where victims were kept. More importantly, she said she had seen several young women pass through there over the months, including one who corresponded to Christine's description. She had blonde hair, blue eyes, a small scar on her forehead, the woman described. She was there for a few weeks, and then disappeared. I never knew what happened to her, but I always remembered her face, because she looked so young, so scared. This revelation devastated, and at the same time gave hope to the Matthews family. On one hand, it suggested that Christine had been kept alive for at least a few weeks after the disappearance. On the other hand, it raised terrifying questions about what had happened afterward. Detective Rodriguez organized an extensive search for isolated ranches in the desert that could have been used by Collins. With the help of satellite technology, now available for police investigations, they identified dozens of abandoned or little-used rural properties within a radius of 300 kilometers from Los Angeles. For 8 months, FBI teams visited these properties with sniffer dogs trained to find human remains. It was arduous and emotionally draining work. At 5 different properties, the dogs signaled the presence of buried organic material. Excavations revealed bones, but later analyses showed they were from animals. At an abandoned ranch near Barstow, 200 kilometers from Los Angeles, investigators found something that made their hearts freeze. In an abandoned barn, there were chains fixed to the walls and remains of old mattresses on the floor. It was clearly a place where people had been held in captivity, but there was no specific evidence about who had been there or when. Forensic analyses of the site revealed DNA from at least 7 different people, all women. But the decomposition of genetic material over the years made conclusive comparisons impossible. It was frustrating to be so close to answers and yet so far. In 2015, almost 30 years after Christine's disappearance, Robert received a call that changed his life. It was from the FBI, informing him that David Collins had been found dead in a federal prison in Arizona. He had been rearrested 2 years earlier for parole violation and had died of a heart attack without ever providing information about his victims. With Collins's death, the main clue about Christine's disappearance died with him. Any information he might have had about her fate had been taken to the grave. Robert, now 75 years old, felt as if a door had closed definitively. Linda had developed early dementia and was gradually losing her memory. Ironically, sometimes she forgot that Christine had disappeared and asked when her daughter would return from school. Robert didn't have the heart to remind her of the truth repeatedly, so sometimes he simply said, "She'll be home soon, honey." Jessica, now an adult woman married with children, visited her parents once a month. She had built her own life in Los Angeles, but carried the weight of having grown up as the sister of the girl who disappeared. Her own children knew Aunt Christine only through old photos and fragmented stories. Michael never married. Now, over 50 years old, he continued visiting the Matthews family religiously, as if he were still the boyfriend waiting for Christine to return. He had become a physical education teacher at the same school where Christine studied. A quiet and lonely life, always wondering what kind of life he would have had if Christine hadn't disappeared. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought social isolation that intensified Robert's loneliness. Linda had been admitted to a specialized care facility. Her mental condition had deteriorated significantly. He was left alone in the house that once housed a happy family, surrounded by ghosts and memories that had become both his salvation and his curse. It was during this period of isolation that he made a decision that would change everything. He decided to digitize all documents related to Christine's case: photos, newspaper reports, police reports, correspondence with other families. He wanted to create a complete digital archive that could be preserved and maybe, one day, help someone discover the truth. While organizing the documents, Robert made a disturbing discovery. Among the papers he had kept over the years, he found a birth certificate of Christine that he didn't remember having seen before. It wasn't the original, which was kept in a safe place, but a second copy he had requested years earlier for some investigation. But there was something strange about this certificate. The paper seemed newer than it should be for a document from 1969. The typography was slightly different from other certificates from that era he had seen. He photographed the document and sent it to a document examination specialist he had met during investigations. The answer came a week later and changed everything. The certificate was fake. Someone had created a false birth certificate for Christine Elizabeth Matthews at some point between 1987 and the present. But why? And more importantly, who had done this? This discovery reignited the investigation that was practically closed. If someone had created false documents for Christine, it meant that someone knew what had happened to her. Maybe she was alive somewhere with a different identity. Or maybe someone was using her identity for criminal purposes. In October 2022, 35 years after Christine's disappearance, Robert made the most difficult decision of his life. He knew he was getting old, that his own health was deteriorating, and that maybe he didn't have much time to discover the truth about his daughter. He decided to make public everything he had discovered over the years. He contacted an investigative journalist from Los Angeles and handed over his entire file on the case. Photos, documents, theories, connections he had discovered. He wanted Christine's story to be told completely, so the public could help find answers that the police hadn't been able to find. That's when the birth certificate found in Coastal Bay entered the story. Sarah Williams, the county employee, was working on a project to digitize old archives when she found the certificate. Initially, she thought it was just another lost document. But when she compared the data with digital records, she discovered something impossible. There was already a birth certificate for Christine Elizabeth Matthews in the official files. 2 birth certificates for the same person. One in the official digital archive, another found lost in a dusty drawer. Both apparently authentic, both with small differences that suggested one of them was fake. Sarah's discovery was immediately reported to authorities. Within days, the story reached the newspapers. Birth certificate of missing teen found 35 years later. The story mentioned discrepancies in the documents and raised questions about possible identity falsification. When Robert read the news, he immediately knew this was the clue he had waited for 3.5 decades. Someone had created false documents for Christine. Someone who knew exactly who she was and when she had disappeared. Someone who might still be alive and have the answers he was looking for. But deciphering the mystery of the 2 certificates would prove more complex and disturbing than anyone could imagine. Because the truth about Christine Elizabeth Matthews was buried much deeper than falsified documents. It was hidden in a network of lies, silences, and secrets that had grown over 3.5 decades. The question that haunted Robert on sleepless nights was simple but terrifying. If someone had falsified his daughter's identity, did this mean she was alive or dead? And who would benefit from keeping the identity of a missing young woman active all these years? In the next chapter, we're going to discover exactly what forensic analysis revealed about the 2 birth certificates. We're going to understand how this discovery completely changed the direction of the investigation and led to revelations that no one was prepared to hear. Because sometimes the truth is stranger and more disturbing than any theory we can imagine. November 2022. The FBI Forensic Laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, received 2 birth certificates that would completely change the understanding of Christine Elizabeth Matthews' disappearance. One had been found in Coastal Bay archives by Sarah Williams. The other was in Robert Matthews' personal files for decades. Both apparently authentic, both impossible to exist simultaneously. Dr. Patricia Chen, a forensic document examination specialist with 20 years of experience, was assigned to conduct the most important analysis of her career. When she opened the sealed envelope containing the 2 documents, she knew she was about to unravel a mystery that had consumed a family for 3.5 decades. The first thing that caught her attention was subtle but revealing: the ink. Under spectroscopic analysis, The ink from the certificate found by Sarah Williams showed a chemical composition inconsistent with standards used in 1969. It was a modern ink produced after 1995, applied to paper that had been artificially aged through chemical processes. But the most shocking discovery came when Dr. Chen analyzed the microscopic fingerprints left on the paper. Using electrostatic enhancement technology, she managed to identify partial prints that had been left during the false document creation process. These prints were sent to the FBI's AFIS system for comparison. The result arrived 48 hours later and left everyone in shock. The fingerprints belonged to Christine Elizabeth Matthews. Christine had falsified her own birth certificate. This revelation completely changed the entire investigation. If Christine had created false documents with her own identity, it meant only one thing: she was alive. At least she was alive long enough after 1995 to have access to the technologies necessary for falsification. Robert Matthews received the call that changed his life on a cold Tuesday in December. Agent Jennifer Walsh, from the FBI, was on the other end of the line with news he had waited 35 years for, but which arrived in a way no one could have predicted. "Mr. Matthews, we have reason to believe your daughter is alive. We need to talk." The meeting took place at the Coastal Bay Police Department, now commanded by a new generation of investigators equipped with technologies that didn't even exist when Christine disappeared. Agent Walsh, Detective Rodriguez, now captain, and Robert sat in a conference room where the walls were covered with decades of evidence and theories about the case. The fingerprints on the forged birth certificate belonged to Christine, Agent Walsh explained. This document was created sometime between 1995 and 2000, which means she was alive at least 8 years after her disappearance. But if Christine was alive and had falsified her own identity, why hadn't she contacted the family? The answer to this question was hidden in a discovery the FBI had made during a parallel investigation into human trafficking. In 2019, during an operation against a forced prostitution network operating between California and Nevada, the FBI had seized hundreds of false documents. Among them, they found several false identities created for women who had been held in captivity for years. The pattern was always the same. Victims were forced to create their own false identities to be used in criminal activities. One of these false identities was Christine Elizabeth Matthews. The discovery made Agent Walsh's blood freeze. Christine hadn't created a false identity by her own will. She had been forced to do so as part of a criminal scheme much broader than any investigation had imagined. The criminal network operated sophisticatedly. They kidnapped young women, kept them in captivity for years, and forced them to create multiple false identities that were sold on the black market or used for illicit financial activities. The victims were kept alive because their identities were worth more than their deaths. For 3 years, a specialized FBI task force worked to completely dismantle this network. The operation, codename Lost Identity, resulted in the arrest of 47 people and the rescue of 23 women who had been held in captivity for periods ranging from 5 to 20 years. Among the rescued women, there was one who made Agent Walsh's heart stop. A 53-year-old woman, graying hair, blue eyes faded by suffering, but with a small scar on her forehead that corresponded perfectly to medical descriptions of Christine Elizabeth Matthews. The woman was found in an isolated complex in the Nevada desert, under conditions that Agent Walsh would later describe as subhuman. She had spent the last 35 years in captivity, forced to create false identities, fraudulent documents, and to participate in criminal activities under threat of death. When agents first approached her, she didn't respond to the name Christine. She had spent so much time being called by other names that she had, largely, forgotten who she really was. The psychological trauma was so severe that she needed months of intensive therapy before being able to talk about her previous life. But gradually, memories returned. She remembered the 18th birthday party. She remembered Michael and the chain with heart pendant. She remembered her parents, sister, the house on Ocean View Drive. And she remembered the day when everything changed. March 16th, 1987. Christine had left the school library at 12:50, carrying 2 books about post-Civil War reconstruction. She was walking along Pacific Coast Highway toward the bus stop when a dark sedan stopped beside her. A well-dressed man, in suit and tie, got out of the car and approached. "Excuse me, miss, I'm David Collins from Pacific Coast Modeling Agency. I saw you at the school, and I think you have exactly the look we're searching for. Would you be interested in hearing about some opportunities?" Christine, polite as always, stopped to listen. Collins was convincing, professional, and seemed legitimate. He explained that there was a photo session scheduled for that afternoon in Monterey, and that if she was interested, he could take her to see the studio. The payment would be $200, a significant amount for a teenager in 1987. Christine hesitated. She knew she should go home, that her parents would be waiting. But the opportunity seemed genuine, and $200 would help her a lot with college costs. She told Collins she would need to call home to tell her parents. Collins, still maintaining the friendly facade, offered his cell phone, a technology still rare in 1987. But when Christine took the phone, she realized there was no signal. Collins said they could stop at a payphone on the way to Monterey. That's when Christine realized something was wrong. The sedan had no license plates. Collins had automatically locked the car doors, and when she asked to get out, he revealed a gun and said the words she would never forget. "You're coming with me, whether you want to or not." For the next 35 years, Christine was held in captivity in different locations. The ranch in the Mojave Desert that the FBI had found in 2010, a complex in Nevada, several apartments in Los Angeles. She was forced to create dozens of false identities, to participate in financial fraud schemes, and to train other younger victims who were brought into the network. The trauma was indescribable. Christine had 3 children during captivity, all raised within the criminal network. She was prohibited from talking about her previous life under threat of death for her and her children. Any escape attempt resulted in severe punishments not only for her, but for other victims. During all these years, she maintained a secret hope that one day she would be rescued. She memorized details about her family, about Coastal Bay, about her previous life. She created secret codes in some of the false documents she produced, hoping that one day someone would find them and understand the message. That's exactly what happened with the birth certificate found by Sarah Williams. More detailed analyses revealed small microscopic markings on the UCO paper that formed a pattern. Help RBM. Help Robert B. Matthews. Christine had found a way to leave clues about her real identity even while being forced to create false documents. The moment of reunion between Christine and Robert happened in January 2023 at a medical facility specialized in trauma victims in Los Angeles. Christine, now using her real name again after decades, was physically unrecognizable. Time, suffering, and trauma had completely changed her appearance. But when Robert looked into her eyes, he could still see the 18-year-old daughter he had lost. "Daddy," was the first word she said. And then, after 35 years of forced silence, she could finally tell her story. Linda, unfortunately, had died 6 months before the rescue, never knowing that her daughter was alive. Her mental condition had deteriorated to such a point that she spent the last years of her life without recognizing anyone. Robert always believed that, deep down, she died of a broken heart. Jessica flew immediately from Los Angeles to meet the sister she had lost when she was still a teenager. The reunion was emotionally devastating. Two middle-aged women, who should have grown up together, shared decades of life, memories, experiences. Now they had to rebuild a relationship that had been brutally interrupted. Michael, now 54 years old, visited Christine at the hospital. He still carried in his pocket a photo of her at 18, faded by time. When he saw her, he broke into tears. The girl he had loved had become a woman he didn't know, marked by traumas he couldn't comprehend. Christine needed 2 years of intensive therapy before being able to start rebuilding a normal life. The traumas from captivity were deep and complex. She suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorder, panic attacks, and difficulty trusting people. But gradually, with family support and specialized professionals, she began to reconnect with who she had been before 1987. Her 3 children, now adults, were also rescued and were going through their own rehabilitation process. They had grown up knowing only life within the criminal network and needed to learn how to live in the normal world. For them, Christine was just the woman who made documents. Discovering that she was their mother and that there was an entire family waiting for them was an additional shock. The criminal network that kept Christine in captivity was completely dismantled. David Collins had died in prison, but his associates were sentenced to terms ranging from 20 years to life imprisonment. The operation revealed that hundreds of women had been victims of this network over 4 decades. Many of the other young women who disappeared on the Central Coast in the 80s were also found, some alive, others dead. Teresa Martinez was found alive in a similar facility in Arizona. Michelle Johnson had died in captivity in 1995. Ashley Wilson was alive, but had developed severe mental problems. The network had operated on a much larger scale than any investigator had imagined. In March 2025, 38 years after her disappearance, Christine made her first public appearance. It was at a conference on human trafficking in Washington, D.C., where she spoke about her experience and about the importance of never giving up on searching for missing persons. "My father never stopped looking for me," she said, with Robert sitting in the front row, tears streaming down his face. "For 35 years, he carried my photo everywhere he went. He never gave up hope. And that hope is what saved me." But even with Christine rescued and the criminal network dismantled, some questions remained unanswered. How did the network operate for so long without being detected? How many other victims are still out there? And why did it take 35 years for the connections to be made? The answer to these questions reveals systemic failures in communication between police agencies, especially in the 80s and 90s. The lack of technology to cross data, the tendency to treat disappearances of young adults as voluntary flights, and the compartmentalization of investigations allowed criminal networks to operate freely for decades. Christine now lives in a small house near Coastal Bay, a few kilometers from where she grew up. Robert, now 78 years old, visits daily. They are trying to rebuild the 35 lost years, one conversation at a time. Christine is learning about everything she missed: the evolution of technology, cultural changes, historical events, even simple things like movies that were released or songs that became popular. she will never fully recover the lost years. The traumas left permanent scars that no therapy can completely erase. But she is alive, she is free, and she is slowly rediscovering who she is beyond the false identities she was forced to assume. The room she shared with Jessica remained untouched for decades and is now being slowly transformed into a space where she can create new memories. The IBM typewriter is still there, and sometimes Christine sits in front of it, trying to type the words she should have written for her high school papers almost 4 decades ago. The case of Christine Elizabeth Matthews changed police protocols throughout California. Now there are mandatory communication systems between agencies for missing person cases. There is less presumption of voluntary flight, and there are more resources dedicated to human trafficking investigations. But perhaps the most important lesson is about the importance of persistent hope. Robert Matthews never stopped looking for his daughter, even when everyone around him said he should give up. His obsession, which many considered unhealthy, was what ultimately led to the rescue not only of Christine, but of dozens of other victims. Today, when Christine wakes up, in her house in Coastal Bay, she can see the ocean through the window. It's the same view she had when she was a teenager, dreaming about the future. The future arrived in a way no one could have predicted, but it finally arrived. On Sunday afternoons, she sometimes walks along the pier where she used to go with Michael and friends. The pier hasn't changed much. Coastal Bay is still a small and peaceful town. But now she walks as a survivor, someone who went through hell and found her way back. The story of Christine Elizabeth Matthews is not just about a solved disappearance. It's about the persistence of family love, about the importance of never giving up, and about how sometimes the truth is stranger and more terrible than any fiction we can imagine. And it's a reminder that somewhere, at this exact moment, there are other families waiting for answers, other parents searching for missing children, other Christines waiting to be rescued. Their cases are waiting to be told. Their truths are waiting to be discovered. The question is not if they will be found, but when.